Hello and welcome to the Athletic NBA Show. I'm Dave DeFore, and it's Friday, so that means it's Nerder. She wrote, joining me as he does every single episode, my partner in crime, Seth Partnow. What's up, Seth?
Hello, Dave.
Hi, welcome back.
Can I try the intro, or are we done with that?
No, we're done with that. We're done with that. And filling in for our other partner, Mo DeKeel, this week, we got Eric Name, our Milwaukee Bucks beat reporter over at The Athletic. So, we're going to get to some Buck stuff here in a minute. Eric, welcome back to Nerder. Hope Your summer has gone well. I know you've been eating a lot of good food, done a little bit of travel. So following your Instagram is always fun because I see the 5 or 6 spots that I remember from Milwaukee with good food. What was that one place, the sandwich place that we went to?
Bavette, maybe?
Yes.
I would guess Bavette.
Great sandwich in downtown Milwaukee. First topic of the day, guys. Our friend John Krasinski over at The Athletic wrote why Anthony Edwards will leave Minnesota discourse is bad for NBA business. And I recommend, number one, go read that. John Krasinski is one of the best reporters that we have. And maybe in basketball, definitely in basketball. But also, I agree. It's bad for business. Listen, the Minnesota Timberwolves are a team that are just now finding success after years of failure. They got a new ownership group. And for whatever reason, another small market team has a star that they drafted and who was developed with them. And the big stories are, oh, well, where's he going to play next? We've already got the Photoshops coming out. And not just that, Michael Jordan and Anthony Edwards are basically the same guy. But man, the Photoshops have already started. His Team USA run is inspiring people to draft him to their team in free agency, which he's got years to go.
6 years.
I don't even understand how we got here. Seth, I guess it's bad for business. It's just bad for business. Every team needs a star, right? Let them keep their stars, at least while they have them.
I mean, this is a topic that we hit out on a lot on this show, is like the transaction stuff, the off-court stuff. It's fun. It's a useful part of it, but it just the amount of the oxygen it sucks up is too much. And I understand it now. I mean, we're the off season, like not a ton is happening. I mean, the of the league's business, there's a couple stalemates, which I'm sure we'll get to, but I will say the one difference in this case versus a lot of the other star get traded is this doesn't seem to be like an agent placement kind of thing. This is like a guy on a podcast spouted off, and now we're talking about it. So, collect your engagement, pass go.
I mean, Eric, this is kind of up your alley as you've dealt with this for pretty much, your entire career up in Milwaukee. So, I mean, look, Anthony Edwards is a good player. And potentially going to be a great player and maybe even an all-time great. We'll see. It's very early. But, man, it really does rain on the parade of the fans in Minnesota. And I think just people who like the NBA in general. I mean, you guys know how I really feel about player movement and how I actually think it's really bad for the league in general. But I think that this sort of discourse in the media is also bad. I mean, not that our job is to make the league better or anything like that, but it's boring. Plain and simple. It doesn't serve anything.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, like, this all started with Patrick Beverley on a podcast mentioning, like, oh, Ant's not going to be there for that long, or, whatever he said. Eventually, he's going to go somewhere else or outgrow Minnesota or however it goes. And, like, I guess from my perspective, obviously, I saw this happen with Giannis, and, I covered the whole Supermax extension the last time he signed it, and we're going to do it all over again here in a little while, and we'll talk about that later in the show. But, like, I guess for me, like, can we just let Anthony Edwards be great first? Like, that part hasn't even happened yet. Like, the part where he's an MVP candidate hasn't happened yet. That's not to take anything away from his playoff performance last year. It isn't to take anything away from what he's done at an incredibly young age. It's all been very good. He's not in the MVP conversation. Like, we haven't even gotten to that point. Like, typically we get there first, and then we say, like, oh yeah, this guy could go to a bigger or better team, or this other team could really use him to, get over the top and win a title. Like, he just signed his rookie extension. Like there's 6
It's
more
not like
years.
this is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander who just made all NBA first team, right?
Correct.
And is leading Team Canada, to an inevitable clash, I'm assuming, with Team USA at some point in the World Cup. I mean, it's not
right.
He doesn't have that resume yet.
And again, I'm not saying that he won't get there, maybe as soon as next year. Like I'm not trying to say any of that. But like you didn't even let Minnesota enjoy the idea of having a franchise player first. Like they didn't even get to do that part. It was just like, well, they don't deserve this guy. Well, it isn't a bit early to say that.
I mean, maybe it's just that the offseason has been kind of, dull. Sure. As Seth sort of alluded to, the couple of pieces of outstanding business, they're both stalemates. It's James Harden, who opted into the last year of his deal and then demanded a trade, and it seems like neither side is kind of budging on that, and we're going to see that come to a head in training camp. And then the story that bores me to tears, which is Damian Lillard asking for a trade a year removed from signing a 5-year supermax. And I'm supposed to feel bad because he wants to play in one place and Portland hasn't sent him there in spite of 0 basketball games being played between the time of the trade request and now. Like, we haven't hit training camp yet, but I'm now supposed to feel bad that he hasn't been traded. I guess, I mean, if you're going to get traded to Miami, you want some time to look for a house. The real estate market is kind of weird. You want to shop around maybe you want to buy points on the mortgage so you're not at the record rates that we're at right now. I don't know, Seth, like why am I supposed to feel bad as a fan here? Is it bad for the league that the Portland Trailblazers are not trading Damian Lillard for, pennies on the dollar before training camp?
I mean, depends on what you mean by the league. If you mean sort of our piece of the league, maybe, although that's actually been pretty good because it's given people stuff to talk about all summer. So maybe just having maybe you want the issue, not the resolution, perhaps, if we're going to be cynical about it. No, I don't have a problem with him asking for a trade.
Definitely not.
Like, it's good to want things. And, but, you mentioned the Supermax contract. That's literally what Portland owes him, is that money. And, maybe if they tried to well, we're going to send you to Charlotte, maybe then we can have a conversation about them not doing right by the player. But them doing right by the player doesn't mean do wrong by the organization. I mean, it's, in another context, we would talk about the management of the Blazers having a fiduciary duty to ownership. It's like, hey, we have, you own this team and we have a responsibility to make it as good a franchise as possible. And, jettisoning talent as a feel-good gesture is not the way you go about doing that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's boring because they are going through that, right? Like, they didn't just do it. So because they didn't just do it, now it's led to what is essentially a boring stalemate where, nothing has really changed. He hasn't changed teams. The players that the Heat have available hasn't really changed. That's remained the exact same. It's just a matter of getting to the points and figuring out the leverage of when
I saw a guy make a behind the back pass in the World Cup though. So that, I think that changes things dramatically. No, part of the reason it's boring is these are some of some of the posturing on is just so non-credible. It's that's the key to winning a game of chicken. 2 cars driving at each other. The guy who takes his steering wheel off and chucks it out the window first wins. And nobody believes that's how Lillard is going to act. So it's like, okay, yeah, you say these things, he's going to make things uncomfortable. Sure, a guy who's renowned for leadership and professionalism is going to suddenly become a team-killing disruption.
Yeah, and also, by the way, I don't think Portland's doing anything on purpose. They're not delaying better offers. I think that they are rightfully waiting to see if they can get something better for a guy who has been a top 15 player in the NBA for a little while. I mean, this is a guy who should be more valuable than what we know, at least what's been reported, that's been offered by the Miami Heat. And, Rudy Gobert got a lot. And I don't think that they're expecting a Rudy Gobert haul because it just doesn't exist. But you got to come up with something a little bit better than Miami. And maybe they don't. Maybe no one does, because he is 33 years old. He does have 4 years left on a giant contract. And maybe there are teams that say, hey, we don't know what the last 2 years of that deal is going to look like. Maybe that's going to cause us to struggle. So, your Brooklyn's, maybe even, I doubt the Knicks would be in on it, but we've heard that Boston might have had some interest, but you can understand why some teams might be holding back, Eric.
And speaking to the other side of it, like, the Heat don't just have to give away the things that they don't want to give away. Like, there's a reason that, and this kind of goes to your point at the very beginning, Dave. 0 games have been played since this trade demand request, whatever you want to say, has occurred. So it's pretty hard for, the pieces involved to trade or to change all that much. Like, the pieces that were going to be in this trade couldn't change all that much. I mean, obviously the draft could occur, and you could see, if all of a sudden the Portland Trailblazers had the first pick in the draft. Okay, that would have changed things a little bit, but that didn't happen. So now everything is what it has been and what it's going to be. Probably until someone plays some games or someone gets into a training camp. Like, we're still a month away from teams getting into training camp at the end of September or the start of October. So, like, all of this just has to stay here because everyone has their own duty, right? Like, they have to get as much as possible in a trade. The Heat have to try to give up as little as possible in a trade. Everyone has to do their duties, and they're doing it. And that's just led to a standoff at this point.
Which is fine.
Right.
It's the only part I think our collective boredom with it is the fact that it's been just so, like, this sort of there's a public staring contest, which, yeah.
Seems like a perfect time, Eric, to bring up Giannis, because he kind of had some things to say over the summer, and it seems like they need to get back to their winning ways, even though they've been winning, and injuries kind of, hurt them the last couple of years. It does seem like running it back with the same guys does have a shelf life with Giannis in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're in an interesting spot now, right? Like, Giannis, in the past has mentioned how, as he was getting ready to sign a Supermax extension, the team needed to be focused on winning a championship, and they needed to be making moves towards that and doing those types of things and pushing towards it. In the summer where he was prepared to sign a Supermax extension, they went all in and they traded for Drew Holiday, and that ended up working out for them. They won a championship, which I think sometimes gets lost in this conversation. There is a banner hanging up in Fiserv Forum. Like, Giannis had the Larry O'Brien trophy in his hands, and granted, he wants to do it again, and that's great. But they actually won one. That did happen just 2 years ago. So yeah, I mean, I don't think anything has changed, kind of from the moment all of this started with Giannis, right? Like, when he signed that Supermax extension, there was always going to be the pressure to compete. He had done the MVP thing. He had done all of the other stuff I had talked about earlier, Anthony Edwards not yet doing. He had already done those things. So when he had done those things, it made sense that the organization was have to push for a championship every year and kind of work through these things. And I think the tough part about, what he said about kind of everyone pushing in the same direction and, trying to push in for a championship and do everything that they can, is that when you look at the championship odds in the last 2 seasons, the Bucks were in the top 3. Again, is there things that they could have done to be number 1 in those rankings? I don't know. Like, if we're talking about moves that they could have made that could have put them there, I mean, maybe there is some small stuff on the periphery that could have pushed them just slightly higher. But if you're talking about the NBA in its current iteration, without the massive cap spike that gifted the Warriors Kevin Durant, we haven't had a favorite like that. That's not how the league in its current form kind of exists. Like, you just want to be in the contention mix and then hope everything hits right. In the last 2 years, Chris Middleton getting hurt in the playoffs and Giannis getting hurt in the playoffs, everything didn't hit right. And sometimes that's just the way it goes. But I can see why Giannis would be like, I haven't won a championship in 2 years, and would want to make sure that the organization is continuing to push for that.
I think that's almost just a fact of the difference between, certainly not every fan or media person is process facing as we are, but we see things and you say, oh yeah, they're thereabouts every year. What more do you want? Then you need to get some breaks. I think that's right. I also think I know that is not the way that anyone in this scenario. I mean, it's a cliche to say it's a results business, and the results have been what they've been. And the fact that there's been some misfortune or lack of good fortune that has played into that is sort of by the wayside. I mean, how far have they got in the last 2 playoffs? How far have they gotten? How many playoff series have they won in those last 2 seasons? And reasons why, sure. But, if from a player and organization, like competitive mindset, that's what they see, not that we were good enough and shit just went bad.
I mean, listen, they fired their coach this offseason.
Well, I was about to get to that, but they brought back the same team. Right. This is the biggest concern I have, is that, they've flown under the radar so far this summer, except for Giannis's comments, because they did not make any changes to the roster, but they have a new coach, same roster. And so I guess my concern is, okay, what's the new system going to look like? How long is it going to take them to develop the system, during the course of the season, get used to it? Because, I think we all agree they've got to do things a little bit differently, not just offensively, but defensively as well, because, Brook is older and frankly, Giannis is a little bit older and not as active as he was in previous years. You now have to deal with a slightly diminished Chris Middleton defensively. Drew Holiday's gotten older, right? Like, so it's an older roster, but new coach. And so, I worry about the learning curve there, Eric.
For sure. I mean, I think there's strong examples of success in the first year of a new head coach in the very recent NBA. You look at some of the teams that have either made deep runs or won a championship with a first-year head coach. It's not impossible. This is a thing that does occur, and it's happened recently. So you don't have to, go digging through the archives to figure out, well, could it actually work with a first-year coach? Yeah, it can. You have to have talent. And you have to have those things in place. But I do agree, ultimately. I think, speaking to Seth's point here, I think as someone who covers the team, I can logically see, all right, this offseason, if you decide not to run it back and you let Chris Middleton walk, you don't just get free money to spend. That's not how the salary cap works. You wouldn't have had that money to spend and grab someone that is, if not Chris Middleton's caliber, close to Chris Middleton's caliber. If you let Brook Lopez walk, the same thing is true. You're not going to find another Brook Lopez. But just because I can logically see that running it back was the logical move, if you want to make moves for the future, that's going to have to come down the road once those guys are signed up for beyond this year and aren't free agents. I can logically see that. But I can understand, as Seth said, why a player might not feel that way. Why, if you're on the team, you're thinking, we're just standing still. Nothing new has changed. And yes, the coach has changed, so the systems will be different. And we'll kind of see how all that plays out coming up here in a month once we get into the preseason and see kind of some of that on the floor. I can understand why it feels like, you're just running back the same thing over and over again, and it hasn't worked the last 2 years. So why is it magically going to be the thing that worked, in 2021? How is that going to work in 2024? Like, I can understand the logic behind all of it. So I do think, this is the start of the process of that next contract. Giannis is signed up for this year, next year, and then we're talking about a player option in the year after that. So that's going into the 25-26 season. So in reality, the Bucks have a little bit more time, but this is the start of these conversations. This is kind of how it all rolls out, right? Like, it doesn't immediately become a situation where they have to sign them to a new contract, it starts with, well, if things aren't good enough, then he's going to have to think about his future. And, I think in the past there was, hints at it, or, things said where it's like, oh, you got to be thinking about a championship. And then the part about leaving was left unsaid. This is, the first time that Giannis said it. In that interview in the New York Times. He put it out there that, okay, if you're not doing those things, I could leave, or I might not stay in Milwaukee. So that is different, and it's a little bit more forceful. But to me, the directive is still the same. Like, this is always about winning championships and winning another one for Giannis.
I mean, I don't think it, given the realities of, okay, 2 years in a player option. So effectively 2 years. So effectively, from a team standpoint, either he is, committing next summer, or you're trading him. Like, that's kind of facts, right? So it's almost the things that were said almost didn't need to be said, because, like, okay, we're either a championship, like we're either in the minimum conference finals or NBA finals this year, or moves are going to be made. I mean, that's like,
yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone thought he was, because he is extension eligible this September. I don't think anyone thought he was signing that first kind of baby extension that you can do. Like, that's not how the top 5 guys in the league do business.
Yeah. Next year is sort of where it comes in. Oh, so I want to ask actually about the basketball team. So you mentioned the new coach, and I think if we were to have among the criticisms that we could kind of give to sort of the old regime, was probably that hurt them in the playoffs, was a over-reliance on sort of kind of solid vets at the expense of unpredictability, dynamism, athleticism. And the roster was kind of tailored that way. With largely the same roster, is that something that can change under Adrian Griffin? Or, like, what do you think is going to be different on the floor?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at kind of what Adrian Griffin said in his like introductory press conference, and a little bit that, he kind of talked at Summer League, you're looking at like a more aggressive defense, right? So going into what Mike Budenholzer has done over the years, you knew that they were going to have a low foul rate, and they were going to try to be great on the defensive glass. Like, those were 2 things that, Bud teams have done in the past. We don't know what an Adrian Griffin team's going to do. We know what a Nick Nurse team did while Adrian Griffin was the assistant. But we don't know exactly what Adrian Griffin's going to do. But I would think when you're looking at the defense, it's going to be, trying to force some more turnovers, trying to get back out on the run. The Bucks have the greatest transition weapon in the history of the game, and didn't end up getting out in transition a whole lot last year. Like, those are things that they can kind of do. Like, they were a good semi-transition team. They shot threes quickly at the start of possessions, but getting back out on the run, I think, is one thing that you can look at. And I would say you're looking at like the top 6 of the roster remains the same from the 2021 championship team, right? Giannis, Chris, Drew, Brooke, plus Bobby and Pat off the bench. Those 6 remain the same. I think where things can maybe potentially change a little bit is, like, they have a guy in Marjan Beauchamp that they spent a 1st-round pick on last year. They have a guy in Andre Jackson Jr. who they're very excited about. Dynamite athlete, and someone that kind of slipped into the start of the 2nd round where they traded for number 36. So I think there is still that veteran core if you want it there. Like, they could lean on Grayson Allen. They signed up Jay Crowder again. Like, you could lean on those things, or you can lean into some of the athleticism of the young guys, some of the unknown that might be there. So I do think, for the first time, those things exist. It's just a matter of, is the lineup that has been built philosophically, the roster that's been built philosophically, going to be coached in that same way? Is a greater emphasis going to be placed on player development and trusting those young guys, in trying to, as we've seen the Raptors that Adrian Griffin came from, and the Miami Heat that have beaten the Bucks twice here in the last couple of years in the postseason, they have hit on some of those, undrafted guys
rangy athletes that can come off the bench and cause disruption. And that's the thing that the Bucks have missed for the last 3 years. I mean, even the title year, they were missing it. It's just that Giannis was overwhelming. And so, I mean, in my opinion, they have to lean into that, especially Beauchamp, who I think can be a top rotation piece for them, and ought to be maybe this year, with the time now in coming up on training camp and being injury free. That's a guy they should want in their top 8 because they need that sort of dynamism. I mean, we talk about it constantly with the Bucks, and it will allow them to play more than one way. And in particular, the transition. They are slow because they're old.
I mean, there's just been so many times in the last couple of years where, it's Giannis out on the break. And to some extent, you do want to get out of Giannis's way, right? Like you want to make the runway as clear as possible. Sure, there can be 4 cones in the way that are those transition defenders, but everything else should probably be clear. But, what if there was a faster guy out in front of him and he could just throw it ahead and he doesn't have to take the beating? Like that, to me, is kind of the thought process behind a guy like MarJon Beauchamp. And you saw him do that a little bit at the start of the year when he's in the rotation. A guy like Andre Jackson Jr., I think at the combine, had the 3rd fastest 3/4 court sprint. He's got a 44-inch vertical. If you watch those Connecticut games, him pushing in transition was kind of the engine behind getting everything started for them. Like, oh, that with Giannis. In the half court, could it be problematic? Yeah, that's very real. But who cares? Why don't they just go dunk and then you don't have to worry about the half court? Like that's a thing that you have to kind of think about.
I think that like if we were to be optimistic, and this is very weird it's a very weird role reversal for Eric being the pessimist and me being the optimist here, is that just the that is not, crazy athlete who can't shoot. That is not a Mike Budenholzer player.
No.
So like to some degree, that is and not just, well, he's the best player available, so we're going to take him, but we're actually going to trade up to select this player, does indicate at least an understanding that there has to be a philosophical change. Because I mean, who you've gotten in the last couple of years in the playoff, you've gotten your ass kicked by Jason Tatum and Jimmy Butler, because that's everyone in the league kind of has a hole of that, like that mid-sized athlete on their roster, they've sort of soldiered on with the Jay Crowders and Wes Matthews of the world, and that's gotten them where it's gotten them. I think Wes Matthews has given them as much or more than you could have reasonably expected, but that's still grading by a certain curve. That's not, it's not okay. You're going to roll him out there and say, okay, that guy, that Jimmy Butler guy, you got him. That Jason Tatum, you got him. And how do you feel about that? And the answer is not very good.
And that's not to say like the whole roster has, added a ton of athletic juice, right? Like that's not to say the whole thing is different, but 2 guys as opposed to
0,
no one that was in the rotation and playing is noticeable. That is something. Like you can still do the old reliable stuff, right? Like you can still count on Giannis and Chris and Drew and Pat and Brooke and
Bobby Portis.
Like all that's great, but like also there's 2 guys that are either going to be in the rotation or on the fringe of the rotation and have a chance to, just give a little something different. And that's just like, if you're talking about counter punches the Bucks could throw in the past, it was like, oh, well, PJ Tucker's here, we can kind of switch more. Well, okay, yeah, but like it's still the same kind of professionalism and the same type of like older player that's just going to like kind of get through, not like dynamic athleticism.
Well, it's predictability versus variability.
That's
right. Exactly. And that's been the sort of thorn in their side. I mean, I guess my last question on this would be, what's their stomach for losing? Like, what's their stomach for not being a 1 seed or a 2 seed and instead of being a 4 seed or a 5 seed, because these guys need reps. And part of young guys getting reps is, they make mistakes and maybe you lose some games that you might win. So like, what's their stomach for that?
And that's really the interesting question, because there was, we've talked about this a lot over the entire lifetime we've been doing this show, Dave, about how reliable they were beating bad teams and getting themselves to, mid 50s plus wins, and not needing to do anything to get that. With that as the baseline, are you going to be okay losing with a 3-game losing streak in December because you've played, MarJon Beauchamp and Jackson 60 minutes total per like between them per game, or that playing into it. Are you going to, oh man, we just a 3-game losing streak. We gotta give all those minutes to Wes and Pat and Grayson and it works, or is this like, okay, it's December, we're scuffling, but we got to work through it because the only way we're going to win a championship is if we work through it. Are they going to be able to, with this same group, except for the coach, are they going to be able to stomach that sort of turbulence?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting team to think about in that regard, because the year that they won a championship, they were the 3 seed, right? That was a team that was not just rolling through the regular season. And they were good. Like, I'm not trying to say they were a bad regular season team or anything, but they were trying some stuff out. And they did go through some growing pains trying to figure out, what they were together with Drew in there. And then when they traded for PJ and getting him in there and trying to figure out some stuff. So they have done it before, but then you just kind of get into a regular season rut like they did last year in December. And it was like, man, it'd be kind of cool if like Chris came back and we just rattled off like 9 straight wins. Wouldn't that be fun? Like, don't you guys like that? And all the vets are like, yeah, man, that sounds so cool. We should do that. And you get into a spot where it's like, all right, like if you're going to do that, if you're going to go through those growing pains, that's got to be top to bottom, right? Like everyone's got to be involved. The vets got to be like, yep, these guys are important. They're going to be a part of this. Like we need to bring them along as well. So I do think that's, to me, one of the interesting questions of this season, one of the many interesting questions of this season, as we figure out what Adrian Griffin is like as a first-time coach and how he navigates those interpersonal dynamics that are very hard to quantify, right? Like they're not X's and O's. They're not like, calling a perfect ATO or whatever it is. Like it's like the nitty gritty stuff of coaching that we can't really quantify. How good is Adrian Griffin going to be at that stuff?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that this is a good place to wrap up. Eric, look forward to your coverage this coming season, as I have every single year. One of my favorite writers. And Seth, anything before we wrap up?
I've actually got next week. We mentioned John Krasinski at the top. We've got kind of a Q&A that we did sort of before the Anthony Edwards news kind of broke, where we talked about sort of what how I saw the Timberwolves roster with respect to the player tiers. So look for that. That kind of got superseded by some some other bits of news. So I believe we're planning on running that next week. So
well, everybody go and check that out, and we'll be back with another episode in a couple of weeks. And I think Mo's back for that. He's on vacation right now, enjoying food in Europe somewhere. So for Seth Partnow and Eric Name, I'm Dave DeFore, and this has been Nerder, She Wrote, on the Athletic NBA Show.